What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk about what the brain is doing during near-death experience, because unmistakably the brain is doing something. Now, I think we're all familiar, or most of us are familiar with the media stereotype of what a near-death experience is. You know, oh, my heart stopped, you know, I rose above my body, I looked down, I could see people pumping on my chest, and I entered this tunnel, and at the end of this tunnel, it wasn't quite like that, at least that's not what I've heard before. But at the end of the tunnel, I met, you know, my dead mother, and we had a conversation, we reconciled many things, and I wanted to join her because I felt so peaceful and enveloped in all the light, and she said, no, it's not your time, and so I was pulled back into my body, and they got my heart going, and I'm back again. Undoubtedly, these things happen, and I am absolutely convinced that people are relating to us how they remember it afterwards. Now, that doesn't mean we have to accept the literal interpretation of these experiences. In fact, I don't. I accept them as the literal memory that they have of these experiences. But it doesn't necessarily, I don't necessarily follow their interpretation. Now, these have great, profound meanings to people, and so they really do have to be treated, and I think rightfully so, with reverence, because they are a spiritual experience. That is, they feel as, the person who's had these experiences feels as if they've touched something greater than themselves, and they've touched it at a time when they are feeling most mortal, when they're dying. But I may also point out, unlike the claims of others who have studied in this area, these experiences do not prove that consciousness, human consciousness, exists outside the brain. There's no scientific evidence for that, no evidence that will hold up to any kind of scientific scrutiny, and consciousness can't exist beyond death or without the brain. I certainly hope so, because we're all. But that's a matter of faith, not a matter of science. And we're here to talk about science tonight. And I kind of wanted to start it out, along with that preamble, I want to start off with a couple things. Now, I would feel remiss. This is my first time in Denmark, first time in Copenhagen. I'm having a fabulous time, by the way. I love it. It is really, it's been a very, very special experience for me, and I'm not near death, but it's been very special. But I would feel remiss. I would feel as I've left out something very important if I did not bring in a Shakespearean quote in the literary home of one of my favorite pieces of literature, that is Hamlet, of course. And Shakespeare, a long time ago, brought out a very important principle that sometimes people forget. It certainly predated Shakespeare, exactly when we don't know. But let me share the quote. And it's, "In his pure brain, which some suppose the soul's frail dwelling house." I love that. I mean, because the brain is our soul's frail dwelling house. And you're going to see how frail it is, I think, as time goes on. Another principle that I think we should not lose track of, and that's actually a statement made by William James, who was an American philosopher and really the founder of, one of the major founders of modern psychology. And he was writing at the beginning of the 20th century. And he produced a seminal work on the varieties of religious experience, and was really the first person to look in a modern way at spiritual experience and categorize it. Although he, interestingly enough, didn't talk much of near-death experience. Near-death certainly fits his conception of a religious experience, and that it touches something greater than ourselves. But regardless of what the origin of the experience was, he drew on actually biblical inspiration when he wrote, "By their fruits ye shall know them, not by their roots." In other words, these experiences are important for what they bring us, the value they have to us, not necessarily what in the brain is doing. I'm interested in what the brain's doing, and I'm a neurologist. That's what I do. But I think an apt parallel actually has to do with food. You know, I had a wonderful meal tonight, a great meal. You know, lasagna. I like lasagna. I didn't care what my pancreas was doing. I didn't care what my duodenum was doing. You know, I was enjoying my meal. So that's the value of the lasagna for me. So, yes, I'm interested in the brain. I want to know what it's doing. I think it gives us important insights. But again, William James is correct. It's by their fruits we should know them. All right. For me, this is how it all started. This was not my experience. Well, actually, it was part of my experience. I was a young doctor in training. I mean, really young, really green. My hair was still brown. And a patient came to me who had just been discharged from the hospital. It was a patient I had known quite well, Joe Herrera. And he was a simple man, a laborer, uneducated, weathered by the New Mexico desert sun. And he told me this incredible story that while he was in the ICU, his heart stopped, and he was about to be taken by the devil. Up there, sorry. I knew I'd screwed up, all right. The devil was coming right here. Here we go. Right there. The devil was coming to take Joe in his ICU bed. But he was not without his resources. His guardian angel came to do battle with the devil to preserve his soul. But, the devil's pretty strong. And instead, as the devil was about to get his way, his Savior, Jesus Christ, came, dispelled the devil, and Joe knew he was going to be saved. He knew he was going home. And so he came home, and he painted this picture. This is the picture he painted. He told me the story, and I said, was it possible this was a vision, that, wasn't real? And he was absolutely adamant this was real as talking to me was. I thought, that's interesting. And he said, I'm going to prove it to you. So he took a picture of this. I still have the picture he brought to me. He said, this is what happened. And I thought, wow, I wonder what's going on in the brain during this. I'm a neurologist. I'm interested in what's happening there. So I filed that away, put it away, and went on along with a very conventional neurologic career, because conventional neurologists don't concern themselves with these kinds of questions, which seem beyond neurologic answer. So I followed away until I reached a point in my career where I could say, the heck with you, I'm going to look at it and I'm going to study it in some way. And what I did was I returned to the original literature. I went to the person who coined the term near death, and that's a fellow by the name of Raymond Moody, who got a PhD before he got a psychiatric degree, and he collected all these stories about near death. So I thought, well, I'm going to start with him. Maybe there'll be some medical details. And he had no medical details, being the psychiatrist that he was. No, that's not it. My wife's a psychiatrist, so I'm very careful about that. And I have great respect because they're my colleagues. But as I was reading through, I came across this passage, and it was the first clue of what was going on, for me, in my mind. And it was a story about a lady who was in the radiology suite, and the radiologist thought she had died, and she had an event, and she was lying there on the gurney, unable to move, paralyzed. And she says, you know, I heard him say, Dr. James, that's the radiologist, Dr. James is her doctor, her other doctor, Dr. James, I've killed your patient, Mrs. Martin. And then the telling thing, though, was, and I knew I wasn't dead. I tried to move or let them know, but I couldn't. Okay? Oh, well, to a neurophysiologist like myself, that was really fascinating, because what that meant was that she was paralyzed. So, okay, she's paralyzed. What natural processes, presuming she wasn't giving any paralytic medications, which I know a radiologist would know how to give, what causes paralysis naturally? And then, boom, it hit me. It's the same brain process that all of us go through every night, multiple times at night. It's a key element to REM sleep, REM consciousness. And so I started thinking through the lens of REM consciousness, what about these experiences? And things just kind of fell right in place. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is not controversial in terms of the brain processes. It's, you know, when I give this talk to neuroscientists, they go, yeah. It's not controversial. These are very traditional, usually boring brain processes, but I'm applying them in an area that is sort of untraditional for neurologists. So, we all know what a near-death experience is, we think, or at least you've heard from the media. But that's certainly not good enough for science, and this is, as I said earlier, this is about science. And, I don't know if I figured this thing out. Oh, yeah. So we have measures of what happens during these experiences, and they all vary. They're all different. You know, there's common elements, but there's unique elements, but they share some features. So let's look at what's been common, what's commonly shared in these experiences. Well, something more than 3/4 or so of people will have. Well, they'll have a sense of peace. They'll see the light. They'll have a vivid senses, something in their sensation has been enhanced. They'll have a sense of being out of their physical body, out-of-body experiences, we're going to talk a lot about that. And they'll have a sense of being in another world. Okay, so that's kind of a very common theme, and it varies from individual to individual depending on their life experiences, depends on their culture. But this is pretty standard. Now, what this tells a neurophysiologist like myself, actually, is that there's no single anatomical structure, there's no single physiologic process, there's no single biochemical system that can explain all this. It's a very rich experience. So it's going to really draw upon a number of conventional, I emphasize conventional, brain processes, and we're going to go through some of that. I hope, as Richard Feynman once said about physics, he's a Nobel Prize winner in physics, he said, it does no harm, and I'm going to paraphrase him because it may not be an exact quote, it does no harm to the mystery to know a little bit about it. So we're going to learn a little bit about near-death. Okay, what causes near-death? Well, they're very different. This is, we studied 55 people had a near-death experience, and this is what caused them in those 55 individuals. Now, heading the list, or nearly so, is fainting, or nearly fainting. That's very common. 1/3 of people during their lifetime will faint. So, maybe near-death experience is very common. But there's a whole cornucopia of things that will cause near-death experience. So, we see a lot of things that cause near-death experience, and that actually raises another question that's fascinating, that's been answered years ago in a highly respected journal, Lancet, that is completely ignored by the literalist. Now, I'm slurring literalists because anybody who literally takes the truth of that experience, you know, and we'll talk more about that, but that believe these experiences are proof of human consciousness outside the brain. They ignore this study. It's a brilliant study, really well done. And the question is, are those people who've had a near-death experience, and we take these reports at face value, I think that they're being true, are they actually medically near death? I mean, really, you would think that would be an easy question, and it is an easy question. So they examined 58 people who reported a near-death experience of one sort or another during many different things, and what they found actually was intriguing. Only half of people were really medically near death, really threatened, whereas serious illness, their heart had actually stopped or something like that. Half of them weren't. They weren't near death. They thought they were near death. They thought they were dying, but they weren't. Maybe they were simply fainting. So let's take a look at the features of those two groups. See if they're different in some interesting way. And again, this is a study that you don't hear a lot of people quoting, but it's a superb study in Lancet, one of the leading medical journals. And let's take a look at whether they really were near death, medical death, or whether they weren't medically threatened. Well, it turns out they saw the light. They're more likely to see light if they have real, true medical peril. 50-50 in terms of the tunnel. Maybe a little bit more, they feel like their sensations were enhanced. They're thinking, it's usually thinking. Actually, most of them found it very pleasurable. Now here's the first chink in the media stereotype. Okay, you were as likely to have an out-of-body experience whether you were actually medically threatened or not. Interesting, huh? So, we're going to explore that a lot more. Their life flashed before their eyes, in the same way. And of course, they all thought they were near death. That's by definition near death, okay? So that's not a surprise. Not very many people quote this study, but it's a fascinating one because it's very telling about what the brain is doing. Okay, we're going to spend a little time on this slide. Okay, this is about consciousness. Consciousness is all the rage these days. Everybody's talking about being conscious. Consciousness of this, consciousness of that, and it gets a lot of scientific attention. And in fact, many of these experiences happen when the person is in a borderland of consciousness. Now, first let me say what consciousness is not to a neurologist. Achieving a new understanding of something. Oh, I've reached a new level of consciousness. That's not consciousness to a neurologist. It's not. That's a change in the content of your waking consciousness. Okay, so it's a content of consciousness as far as the brain is concerned. And again, tonight we're talking about the brain. Now, from a brain standpoint, there are only 3 states of consciousness. Consciousness means aware of the external environment, like I'm aware of you, or aware of your internal environment, like you might now be aware of your left foot sitting on the floor, that you weren't up to that. That's an internal awareness. There's all consciousness. So there are 3 states. There's waking consciousness, which most of us are in right now. I know there's a couple of people trying to sleep back there, but most of us are in waking consciousness. There is 2 other forms of consciousness that are sleep consciousness. One is REM consciousness, rapid eye movement consciousness. It's really defined by activation of the visual system. And then there's non-REM sleep. Those are 3 states of consciousness. That's all the brain has to choose from in terms of physiologically from consciousness. So it's really kind of a simple deal. Now, to create those 3 states of consciousness, there is some brain that you require, okay? And I think most everyone's familiar with the cortex. That's sort of the walnut-shaped thing that you see pictures of. And this is responsible for the content of your consciousness. This is what gives you your speech. This is what gives us the sensations. This is what makes us human. And so this is where a lot of people who are explaining the brain and near-death experience want to go, because after all, near-death experience touches on what makes us most human. So you'd look at the cortex, the part of the brain structure that makes us most human, but in fact, that's misleading. We'll come back to that. So this is responsible for the content of consciousness, and you need actually two hemispheres to be conscious. You could lop out one hemisphere like that, which sometimes happens when someone has a massive stroke, and your content of consciousness is going to be horribly changed, tragically changed. But you're still going to be conscious. You'll still have wake, you'll still have sleep, REM and non-REM sleep. You'll still have consciousness. In order to lose consciousness, you need to take out both hemispheres, and the thalamus, we'll talk about the thalamus in a moment. Then you'll lose consciousness, and consciousness as a human being is not possible. Now, that actually is oftentimes what's happening with near death. The brain is very particular about its blood flow. It relies on an energy metabolism that requires oxygen. If the blood flow to the brain stops for 10 seconds, you will lose consciousness. Now, that's not very long. So when blood flow is being threatened the brain's blood flow is being threatened, it sees that as a crisis, and it will kick in survival mechanisms and reflexes. So that's very, very important. So a lot of times out in the field, if you're fainting, when we say field, we mean, outside the hospital, or even in the hospital. A lot of times in your heart rhythm's abnormal, it's beating irregularly, or you're fainting, in fact, the blood flow is kind of coming and going to the cortex, so you're in and out of consciousness because both these hemispheres are impaired, and that's sort of a borderland of consciousness that I speak about. So that's one of the things that's important. But a cortex isn't enough. You actually need a brainstem. And what the brainstem does is there's an arousal system that projects to the cortex, and it drives the cortex. It gets the cortex ready so that the cortex can function and communicate with itself. So it sets the stage for the cortex to give us content of consciousness. This drives the cortex. Now, if you were to cut right here, you would be permanently unconscious, comatose, and you would, in fact, even though you had cortex there, you couldn't have any content of consciousness. It's impossible, because you need the brainstem here to drive the cortex. Now, deep within this region here, we're going to talk a little bit about this, is in fact the switches of consciousness between REM and waking consciousness. It's in the brainstem here. Now you think I'm going to turn you all into neuroanatomists, and I might. But if you want to understand what the brain is doing, you kind of have to understand some function of the brain. Now, the brainstem has two basic systems for driving consciousness, driving the cortex, so it's ready, okay? And one of them is an acetylcholine is the chemical messenger. And in the blood, if it's in the heart, nerves of the heart, it slows the heart down. And then there's the adrenaline system, and all the brain's adrenaline comes from a little tiny area in the brainstem, and this projects upward too. So these are two brainstem structures that are crucial in switching between REM consciousness and waking consciousness. They're actually fundamental. And they work in a seesaw way. Now, say during the awake state, the REM switch, this brain switch, makes adrenaline the main chemical in the brain. And that's when we're all awake here. Okay? During REM sleep, Yeah. The adrenaline comes down, and you have acetylcholine. And it's during this time we get the dreaming mechanisms. You know, we have the visual activation, the activation of the visual system, a very robust, extremely robust activation of vision, which means light. And we can have paralysis because we are actually paralyzed while we're having our dreams. If you're not paralyzed when you're having your dreams, you can actually act out your dreams, and it becomes actually quite a dangerous thing. And so you're paralyzed during that. But there's a second borderland of consciousness. And most often, that switch that brings us either to awake or sleep works 99.99999% of the time okay. But occasionally it doesn't. Occasionally it blends waking and REM consciousness into sort of a hybrid conscious state. Okay? And that's where things get kind of interesting. Now, as it turns out, we found, and we knew the basic mechanism at the time we did the study. As it turns out, a lot more has become known, and it's fit very nicely with our thinking. We went and we found that people who've had a near-death experience are much more likely to have a brain switch that blends these two states of consciousness. It's kind of intriguing. They're wired differently than people who haven't had a near-death experience. In narcoleptics, this happens all the time. And, sleep paralysis, sleep. So you're blending REM and waking consciousness. So what happens when you blend REM and waking consciousness? Well, you can become paralyzed. You can wake up, be completely paralyzed. It's terrifying. Lasts for what seems like an eternity. You can have visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations. You're activating the light. And you can actually have dreams while you're awake. You can evoke the dreaming mechanism as blending these states of consciousness right here. So that happens quite a bit. We know a lot about, What did I do there? Turned it off. That's what I did. We know a lot about the REM switch. It's deep in the brainstem. It has lots of components. I love to read and think about it. I am not going to trouble you guys with it. You just know that switch is there. And there's many components, and it switches this back and forth. So, we talk about states of consciousness, waking, REM, non-REM, okay? And these are crises to the brain. Everyone thinks they're dying. That's, what bigger crisis is there than thinking that you're dying? And so the consciousness switch has to be tightly linked to what Walter Buchanan said was the fight or flight response. So our survival reflexes depend on a tight link to our conscious switch. For example, this is a depiction of Homo erectus, probably one of the first real humanoids. And he's kind of hanging out under the fruit tree. You can see a whole troop of them. Now, let's say they hear or see a large cat in the brush nearby. Okay. Now, how many would vote that going into REM consciousness at that moment would be a good thing? No. You'd think waking consciousness might be a whole lot more useful for survival, and it is. Okay. That is so intuitive we don't think about it. But the brain can't take it for granted. Yeah, we take it for granted, but the brain can't. The brain has to be deeply hardwired to make sure it is alert as it's responding to danger. Now, it gets a little more complicated than that. I'm going to just say that this is intriguing, and I hope you follow me with the little details here. Okay? This is the locus coeruleus, the source of adrenaline during wakefulness. And when you're kind of alert, not attentive, like many of you are, like you over there, your locus cerebral is just kind of hanging out, it's kind of firing intermittently. It's like, you're eating, a few, fruit under the tree, no big deal. You're not paying any attention. Suddenly you hear or see a cat, and boom, it's firing like mad. It's firing like crazy. Behavior changes. In fact, this little nucleus right here is so important to human behavior, or monkey behavior, primate behavior, that it changes its firing pattern before you see the change in behavior. It's so tightly linked, and it's so important, because probably what this is doing is driving attention. So here you're inattentive, here it's firing like crazy, and you're scanning your environment. You're looking, do I run up the tree? Do I escape there? Do I fight the cat? Is my wife safe? Is my child safe? So you're scanning, you're making all these assessments of the danger. But once you decide on what to do, like, oh, I can reach that tree, okay, then you have to focus on that escape route, because you can't be running to that tree and go, geez, I wonder what's over that ridge there. You might get eaten. So the brain has to be tightly linked. Attention has to be tightly linked. These are very, very important things that few non-neuroscience people really think about. So, going back here, you can see how this arousal and consciousness is important. This guy shouldn't be going into REM sleep, okay? So it's tightly linked. But you know what? It doesn't always work well. But we know there's a tight connection. For example, if you stimulate the main nerve from the heart to the brain, boom, you go from wakiness to REM consciousness like that. In fact, it's been called a reflex. It's so fast. It's very reproducible. Happens in humans. This just happens to be cats. So there's a link to the nerve from the heart to your conscious states. And this is intriguing, I know. I throw it up there just to look impressive, actually. Not really. But let me walk you through a little bit of this, because this is really crucial. You go, why would REM consciousness appear during a moment of crisis? That's counterintuitive. I mean, it really is counterintuitive until you think about it. Okay, in this case, the animal has been bled about 10% of its blood volume, and it kicks in the adrenaline system, and the heart rate goes up, and it maintains blood flow to the brain by increasing the heart rate, okay? If you lose a lot of blood, like 30% of blood volume, something paradoxical happens. The blood pressure drops, and instead of the animal being alert and vigilant, it lays there quiet, inattentive, not moving. Now, why that should happen, we don't know. I mean, no one knows. But this is, in fact, deeply embedded into our brain stem, which is highly conserved evolutionarily. It means it's really important for survival. For some reason, this is really important for survival. But why, it's not quite clear. Maybe, I can give you concoct scenarios, like an impala is hemorrhaged, it's in the lion's jaws, the lion pride stops eating that impala while it looks submissively into the lion's eyes, and the rest of the herd escapes. Maybe. I don't know, that's all conjecture. But this is really true, this really happens. But what's interesting is what drives this quiescent inattentive behavior, diminishing heart rate, is in fact a key element of the REM consciousness switch. So a big part, this REM switch is very, very important in this phenomena. So this is a way in which the REM mechanism can be triggered during crisis, cardiovascular crisis. So let's switch gears. You've now got PhDs in neuroanatomy. And I want to apply that to experience. Now let's talk a little bit about the experience of near-death experience. And of course, everyone knows about the out-of-body experience. You're going to get a lecture later on in the series from Ulf Blank And he is the world's authority on out-of-body experience. I'm not going to talk much, but I am going to tell you how it touches upon near death. Lots of things cause out-of-body experience. I mean, lots, and not just near death. It may be the most common thing, okay? What's intriguing is that nearly 6% of Europeans, and it surveyed a large number, in the general population have had an out-of-body experience in their lifetime. Now that means a lot of people in this room have had an out-of-body experience. Now you don't have to raise your hands. Oftentimes you'd come up after and tell me about it. But it's very, very common. 1 in 20 people is a very common phenomenon in medical terms. So when do they have it? Well, is it during near death? Probably not. Now, we know this area is integral for out-of-body experiences. We studied, now Dr. Blank studied people who had seizures here, and he put an electrical grid on the brain and found when he stimulated here, boom, person would be out of the body, turn the stimulation off, boom, they're back in, turn the stimulation on, boom, they're out of their body. It's like, a fraction of what a 60-watt light bulb would require. So it's like flip of a switch. Probably what's happening is that this is where your body sensation is, like what's the position of your right arm right now? That comes from here. This is your visual system, the sensation here. This is your orientation, actually it's probably right about there, in a gravitational field, Earth's gravitational field, whether you're up, you're down, or you're moving. Okay, all of these converge here to give you the sense of where you are, okay? And so if you disrupt that integration somehow, it's very likely how you get an out-of-body experience. That's the current thinking, and it seems to make a lot of sense. Now, there's a very strong relationship between out-of-body and REM consciousness, extremely strong. In fact, most of the 6% of the Europeans that have had an out-of-body experience is probably during REM blending with waking consciousness, usually during sleep paralysis. So it's probably that time when they're having it. Now we know there's a strong connection because narcoleptics who have a very abnormal REM switch are constantly blending REM and waking consciousness together. So we know that there's a strong relationship, and it's probably under these circumstances. Okay. What we found when we queried our near-death subjects, we found that 3/4 of them had an out-of-body experience sometime in their life, just like whatever. So 3/4 of people who've had a near-death experience have an out-of-body experience. 31% had their out-of-body experience only during near death. Okay. So when's the other time they had it? They had it during REM intrusion, when REM was blending with waking consciousness. In fact, they're more likely to have it there, slightly more, than during the near-death experience itself. So REM is very, very important to the genesis of an out-of-body experience. So, how could that be? Well, remember this area right here, where if you disrupt that area, you get an out-of-body experience? This is a compilation of many people's brain activity during REM consciousness. And the brain turns off 2 areas during REM consciousness. One is the dorsolateral prefrontal area, and Dr. Voss, who's in the audience, her work has shown that the electrical activity changes in this area. This gets turned off, and probably accounts for the bizarreness of the dreams, because this is where we have most of our executive thinking, our decision-making, our logical processing. That's an explanation for why dreams are so bizarre. Look at the other area. It's right there. It's actually a different side of the brain, but right there, same area. So that is normally turned off during REM consciousness. Now, part of REM consciousness is actually an internal isolation, an isolation of the individual from the outside world. So there's a shutting down, and this actually may be part of that. So, we talked about fainting, and it's one of the common causes of near-death experience. A German investigator, Dr. Lancet, some time ago, reported in Lancet his experience, not his direct personal experience, his professional experience in subjects that he had faint in his laboratory. And they reported what they saw, or what they felt, how they experienced. And he compared his fainting, that's syncope means fainting, he compared his fainting subjects with those with near-death experience. And in his mind, there really wasn't a big difference between the two. That fainting, so in the pleasant confines of a sterile laboratory, induces the key elements of a near-death experience. And I don't think that should come as a surprise at this point. And that includes out-of-body experiences, which happened 4 out of 30 times. That's a lot. That is a lot. So out-of-body experience is common in fainting. So why the similarity? Well, I think that during fainting, during cardiac arrest, which to the brain looks very, very similar. You know, your heart stops because of asystole, or you develop ventricular fibrillation. That looks pretty much well the same to the brain as if, you know, you stand up too quickly, get woozy, and pass out. You know, just blood is leaving the head, and you are getting, the brain just sees this as a crisis. So it's behaving in a very similar fashion. And very likely, it's behaving like an animal that's lost a lot of blood, where you're triggering REM consciousness through the REM brainstem switch. So, I covered a lot of material. I think I even left some time for a fair number of questions, which comes as a surprise to me, because usually I fill the vacuum. But for me, the fun part is not talking like this, because I already know what I'm going to say. I'm really interested in questions, because that's actually where I learn, and so I'm a little selfish in that regard. But studying near-death experience scientifically has challenges. Okay, one of the challenges it has is that nobody dies from near-death experience. The brain is not dead during near-death experience. The brain is not stopped functioning during near-death experience. Human consciousness has not left the brain during near-death experience. These are not return from death experiences. These are near-death experiences. So that's really important. But scientifically, studying them, nobody wants to pay for that. I mean, nobody dies from a near-death experience. So government agencies tend not to want to pay for things like this. As interested as the general public is, funding agencies don't have a great deal. So that's certainly one challenge. Another challenge is this. We talked about context is important for the experience. You know, when we said that only half of people who had a near-death experience were medically threatened, the other half did not, but they thought they were dying. So the context of danger is crucial for an experience. And you can't really reproduce that in the laboratory. I mean, you can't, you know, obviously ethically, you know, think someone's going to get killed or die. That would not be ethical at all. So there's certainly challenges, but that doesn't mean that we're without our resources and without some means of doing so. And what I'm just going to talk and basically introduce the idea, because and I'll show you in just a moment. So we can't just have somebody stick their head in a scanner or whatever we want them and say, okay, have a near-death experience and let's see what happens. You know, it's a lot more complicated than that. But that doesn't mean it can't be done. Okay. Now, this is a neurology resident. He's in training for neurology. And as I said, syncope reproduces a great number of the critical features of near-death experience. And so we can, in fact, make people faint ethically, safely. And so, but the challenge is recording that. Okay, and so in this case, this is actually a tilt table, and it's down, but we can put it up. And how do you make someone faint? Well, there's lots of ways, and I bet you many people in this room know those ways. But sort of, it's an old party trick, usually done by adolescents, and it's where one squats. Okay, so you're squatting. The key point is you're hyperventilating. And the reason you hyperventilate is because the blood vessels to the brain narrow. And so they squish off blood to the brain because of the hyperventilation. You stand up quickly so the blood drains from the head through gravitation and other forces. And so the blood drains from the head, drains from the eye, and then you grunt down like this, like you're bearing down, like having a bowel movement. We call it Valsalva in medicine. And that reduces the blood flow to the heart, so that means the heart can't pump enough blood, and you can induce fainting. And then, so he faints, and then we drop. So we can do that. I'm not going to show you any data, because one of the things that has been a perennial and recurrent problem for, I think, the whole area, and one that really greatly annoys me, is the presentation of things without full peer review. Peer review is very, very crucial. You need anonymous peers judging the data, and until that, I don't think it should be released to the public. And I had some very interesting data, but it's not ready yet. But what we're seeing, is that some of the twitching that happens looks like the twitching and loss of tone that we see with REM, but that's a story to be developed later. Now, let me sum up very quickly, if I have enough time to do so. There are a lot of very traditional, non-controversial, really boring brain mechanisms that come into play with near-death experience. There's not one single thing. There's not a near-death center of the brain, okay? Life isn't that simple. It's not that easy. And the brain's not that easy, okay? But there's a lot of features. The tunnel. Well, what happens is that even though the brain's very sensitive, the cortex in particular, the eye, the retina, the light-sensitive tissue in the back of the eye, is even more sensitive. And when it begins to fail, vision fails, it fails in an out-to-in pattern. So it looks like you're looking through a tunnel, okay? The activation of light, well, we said the REM system, rapid eye movement consciousness, has a very robust connection with light. I mean, its job is to produce light, and so that explains why we can see light, and we can see a tunnel. Now, you appear dead because you're paralyzed. In syncope, with falling, fainting, whether it's from the party trick or whether it's from your heart, you faint, you fall down. As soon as the cortex fails, you collapse. And you can come back into awareness, but you'll still be weak, like Mrs. Martin was in the radiology suite, and that may be mediated probably from the REM system. The out-of-body experience, we talked about how triggering the REM system can trigger an out-of-body experience. Life review, you don't need to trigger anything to see your life flashing before your eyes. And this has been really well shown with people, climbers who've fallen and feel that they're about to die. they'll have a rush of memories. Bliss, the dopamine reward system, and that's triggered by the REM system. There's a definite connection there. You ever notice that with near-death experience, there's a narrative quality to the experience. It's not like the mystical sense of oneness, of the unity of the universe. There's a real beginning, middle, crisis, resolution with near-death experiences, and the narrative of near-death experiences. So it has a real narrative quality, and very likely that's partly the limbic system and the REM system that's generating that, along with the left hemisphere. A lot of the paranormal phenomena that we're seeing, that's very limbic. Limbic being like the sense of déjà vu, things like that. Sense of ESP, that's limbic system, and there's a tight connection in the limbic system with the REM system. And the mystical sense of oneness, which has not really been well studied with near-death experience, which is a shame because it really could be. But we have a really nice understanding of what underlies the mystical sense of oneness, something that's usually brought on like with psilocybin or LSD, or spontaneously, of course. And that seems to work through the serotonergic 2A receptors and the limbic system. For example, years ago, and you could never do this study today, someone was given LSD in 1965 in England before they had brain surgery for seizures. Okay, so they gave LSD, and they looked at the response, and they had, very characteristically, that mystical sense of oneness, which, by the way, is probably historically the most important religious experience. And they had it. They went in and took out part of the temporal lobe where the seizures were coming from. Could be left, could be right, didn't seem to matter. And then they gave them LSD again. And what they found was that they were incapable, people were incapable of having that mystical sense of oneness. So we know that LSD and psilocybin stimulate the serotonergic 2A receptors. Somewhere, very likely, it's in the limbic system, but there's a lot we don't know, but that's very likely it. Now, there's a lot of evidence that converges from different sources why the REM consciousness is triggered during crisis, counterproductively, where it's probably the most important thing happening. It gives the best explanation for many elements of the near-death experience, but as I said earlier, it's not just one answer here. Because we know that REM switch misbehaves with low blood pressure, low blood flow to the brain. We know that people who have near-death experiences are more likely to do this blending of REM and waking consciousness. So the REM system is playing a role. I think that's pretty clear, and we have several lines of evidence that are converging on that fact. So, with that, I want to do a little shameless self-promotion here. I give a fuller explanation in the book there. See, I guess that was, and that's the English for the American version. There's another English, and the closest I could get to Denmark was Holland. So it's a Dutch version. And the Dutch are very keen on this topic, but that's it. So I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for putting up with me, and I wish you all well for the evening. Thanks.